Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in TradFi, digital assets, technology, and financial planning. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site is Nick Cavanaugh, co-founder and CEO of Sensible Weather, Shara Ticku, co-founder and CEO of C16 Biosciences, and Dr. Brendan Hermalyn, founder and CEO of Thalo Labs. They join me to discuss the impact of climate change and best practices for implementing sustainable technologies. It is great to have everyone with us. Welcome to TradeTalks. Welcome to Market Site. Let's go around the horn here quickly and just give us some background, Nick, where you fit within the climate ecosystem.
Sure. So we are a climate data company and a fintech company. We build products around financial risk, particularly impacting hospitality markets. So this is people going on vacation. It's one of the largest economies in the world and massively weather impacted. We build products that basically protect the merchants and consumers when bad weather strikes.
And Shara?
Yep. C16 Biosciences is a New York-based biotechnology company, but different than most biotechs which make pharmaceuticals. We produce high-performance ingredients for consumer applications. So think food, personal care, and home care. We're specifically focused on the $250 billion oils and fats market. And our first product line, a palmless platform for sustainable ingredients, is solving palm oil. And just to hit on climate, palm oil alone is responsible for about 2% of annual greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than the entire global aviation sector.
Yeah.
And Thalo Labs is also a New York City-based climate tech company. In terms of where we sit in the ecosystem, we work directly on emissions. So we make systems and platforms that are designed specifically to reduce emissions coming out of, for now, the buildings. Ultimately with the goal of not just accelerating the drawdown of greenhouse gases that are coming out of our built infrastructure, but ultimately turning it into a net carbon sink where we can actually capture more CO2 than we're emitting in buildings.
You know, it's so interesting when you think about climate tech, the first thing that comes to mind what's happening with energy, right? But here we have three very different industries. So how can sustainable solutions make an impact within your particular sector?
Well, I mean, it's one of the most important components of this sector and within the built environment. The built environment is currently responsible for at least the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. I actually think it's worse than that if you start including refrigeration loss, which is a huge problem we haven't talked about all that much yet. But it hits at the core because heating, cooling our buildings in New York City alone, that's like 71% last year of the emissions from the city wasn't from aviation or transport or anything else. It was just from heating and cooling the building. So when we talk about sustainability in the built environment, it's like absolutely core and key to it.
Yeah, well, which is so interesting because, again, the first thing you think of is energy, what's happening with emissions, cars, airplanes, but you don't think about the day-to-day stuff because you don't see it. You can't really hear it. You don't think about it. I mean, even to your point with the impact from palm oil, I mean, how do you even get that under control?
Yeah, and we do have an emissions story. I said palm oil emits more CO2 than the entire global aviation sector. But I think it's also about land use, and climate is often about emissions. And yes, we have to get emissions down to zero, but we have to do the same thing with land use. And as we think about consumer products, today, palm and other ingredients, so the EU just passed this deforestation regulation, which is covering 7 key crops, including palm oil. Today, the only way to buy it is from palm oil, which is agriculturally based, and you have to prove that it didn't come from deforestation. There's essentially no way to do that today. Geolocation has basically failed. Sustainable sourcing has failed. And so these companies, our customers, the large multinational consumer goods manufacturers, are essentially looking to totally shift the way they source. They want something that looks and functions just like palm oil, but has a different supply chain. And that's where biomanufacturing comes in.
Right. Well, of course, the whole thing is, too, you can have a company with a strategy, but it's a supply chain that impacts it, from the top down.
Completely.
Right. So, Nick, when you're thinking about weather, I mean, that's one variable you can't control.
Yeah, so I actually come from a world of energy, and the way that I think about weather, which is naturally volatile, and climate change, which is making things increasingly volatile, it demands solutions that are physical solutions and that are resilience-based solutions, but it also demands financial solutions. So the way that we think about it, in energy trading, there's massive fluctuations in price related to what happens with the weather, and when there are massive fluctuations in price, people are left exposed. A utility, for example, might seek an insurance cover against that fluctuation in price, which is in turn related to the weather. This is going to exist all over the world. whether it's in hospitality or energy or agriculture or freight. Talk about supply chain, concrete, cement, built environment. The way that we see it is essentially these financial solutions are massively scalable and allow you to sort of round out the edges of climate. Works to make the world more resilient in a sort of financial way instead of a more built physical way.
Yeah, we actually did a segment on concrete and certainly learned a lot there in terms of its climate impact. I mean, certainly a great investment case for all of this, because I mean, it needs to scale, right? And you're going to need the resources for it. I mean, that's a different topic. But what are some of the challenges dealing with the impact of climate change? Is it because, again, there's a variable like weather? Is there a problem with quantifying it, being able to tell that story, being able having the energy resources to execute on these climate strategies? All of the above?
I mean, all of the above. I mean, for us, there's a data problem. So our key challenge in bringing things to market is climate data is huge. And when you're tackling problems at scale, processing lots and lots of data, particularly very quickly, is hard. So coming from the fund space and energy, it's a very specific problem, but we're essentially processing data in tens of milliseconds in order to front run the market, to know exactly what's going to happen faster than the next guy. Bringing these solutions at scale, think at the scale of sort of Stripe on the back end with payments flows, it's a massive amount of data that you need to process. Increasingly where that data comes from, remote sense, satellites, radar, transmitting that data either across wires or through the air, that's a problem as well. And then finally distributing these products. That's a key challenge. In order to get products out, you need to sell them. And getting them in front of whether it's a business or a consumer, that's a challenge.
Yeah, well, it's also quality of data in, data out as well.
Absolutely.
Right, I mean, you both know, all three of you know that coming from the academic world, especially with the data that's being extrapolated and how that's being used to support a thesis or not. What are some of the challenges that you see within your space?
I like you were saying the word problem before, and we think about this a lot because the capital P problem is actually relatively simple for climate. It's where we have too much greenhouse gases entering and staying in the atmosphere. That's it. That's the whole thing, right?
What do you do about it?
What do you do about it? And more importantly, but how do you map that to, because if you go to a building or you go to a company that wants to do something in that space, that's not actually their problem, right? They care about it, but their problem is regulation, which is thankfully causing a lot of small p problems for companies and regulated bodies to be concerned about and to spend money on this. It could be they need to look good in their ESG report. It could be a lot of different things. Here in New York, we have Local 097, which is the first carbon fine structure on the planet. That is a nice big problem for companies to solve. And when you can map the capital P issue to those small individual ones, that's actually the real issue. I think from a technical standpoint, we of course need new solutions, but we have a lot of stuff that would really make a huge difference if we implemented it right now. It's just, it's painful, it's expensive, and sort of challenging. So if you're not mapping those problems across boundaries, we're not going to get to the scale we need to, certainly not in the time frame we need to.
Right, well, I would imagine, Shara, you're thinking about scale all the time, right? I mean, the geographies that you're dealing with.
Yeah, and we're talking about, in palm and vegetable oils, tens of millions of metric tons per year. And so we've developed this solution which can make an oil that looks and functions just like palm oil. Great. We've scaled it. We're operating in 50,000 liter fermentation tanks. And so can this scale? The answer I always give is, has the beer industry scaled globally? We've got beer fermentation capacity globally. It's produced almost everywhere in the world at cost. And that's what we need to do. But that's steel in the ground, and so we need to sort of really accelerate the pace at which we're deploying those modular reactors and scaling them to compete with an industry which is producing tens of millions of metric tons per year.
Yeah, you had mentioned before whether it fits within their ESG reporting. Do you think some of the challenges could also be associated with the subjectivity of it? I think, being able to quantify, especially when you think about buildings, I come to work every day, I'm not thinking about how much carbon we're, emitting out of Nasdaq, right? Yeah. My first thing is, okay, how many conferences do I have to go to this year? How many planes do I have to take? That's how I think the average person thinks. So is subjectivity and being able to quantify it a challenge?
There's a quote from a guy I used to work with. We were flying spectrometers over areas. And he said, if humans could see in infrared, we wouldn't have an emissions problem because we'd be watching just huge amounts of pollutant of trash getting dumped into the waste dump in the sky. There's a building pretty close to here that emits, we just ran the number for it. It was 27,000 metric tons of CO2 per year comes out of that one building. And you think, that sounds like a lot, right? That's a very big waste management problem. And I agree that there's a little bit of not just subjectivity, but the observability of talking about this esoteric thing that's like, oh, there's too much greenhouse gases. Yeah, but all the downstream components that it causes maybe are the only ones that we can't observe.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember at the beginning of COVID, it was either March or April 2020, the New York Times did an interactive map showing, this is how much air traffic we had, and everything was like blue and purple and red, and then over the first 4 to 6 weeks, without people traveling, it went to almost white.
Yeah.
I mean, it was, and that was, for me, I was able to get it, and I think that that's part of the issue. You can't see what's coming out of the buildings, right?
Yep.
As a climate scientist, I was frustrated, publishing papers trying to make people care. One of the reasons why I really wanted to go into hospitality is because you'd be like, there's a heat wave that is on fire. Like, you were traveling there, it's on fire. You want to go skiing, there's no snow. Like, there's no realer impact to that to your average person. And working in hospitality, it's a very obvious link. And it's nice to be able to prove that obvious link at scale and then do something about it.
Right. So what do you think the best approach is going to be to implementing sustainable technologies at scale, bringing the costs down, getting consistent global regulation on it, or at least major regions having regulation in place?
I mean, I think very much depends on the industry. Like so many industries before it, subsidies are invariably going to come into play, particularly for energy, probably for biofuels as well, and biomaterials.
Yep. So speaking of energy, and again, you guys are obviously the academic experts in the space, do we have enough energy on the power grids, if you will, to supply all of these technologies coming on board, right? EVs take up a lot of power. AI, I mean, so we've been talking about this week is the NVIDIA conference, and these $30,000, $40,000 chips are going to be making, the data centers that they have to build. Is there enough energy for everyone to get their priorities resolved?
The challenge with energy is not the amount, it's the ramping, it's the up and down. There is certainly enough fossil fuels to light up power plants and power everything you need, at least for the near-term future. The problem is, how do you ramp them quickly? When everybody gets home from work and turns on their light, turns on their heat, whatever, you go from 0 to 100 very quickly. Where you have duck curves and solar power in sunny states like California, that makes the problem worse. So you have these steep ramps where all of a sudden you need a lot more energy, and you need it very quickly. In order to solve that ramp, you need to have other solutions than the ones that we have today. Right. One of the common solutions that people look to is storage. Whether it's flywheels or batteries or whatever, that's a potential solution, but we don't have nearly enough storage right now.
I feel like it can't also be an either-or solution, right? If we want to move to renewables and more climate-friendly energy sources, we can't turn off fossil fuels. We kind of need some of that power as the transition is happening. So I don't think it's necessarily in either-or, right or wrong, or you're bad or good. I think we're still going to need older technologies, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think what is most essential is how fast can we accelerate the drawdown, right? Like that. What really counts is, and I, as an environmentalist, right? Like, believe me, I really would like to stop burning a lot of things, because that is causing pretty direct issues with the total amount of greenhouse gases staying in the atmosphere. But like, you can't do it immediately, and a solution that gets you, the hybrid car version of getting 80% of the solution but doing it very, very broadly is, I think, arguably much better than doing 100% correct but not being able to scale it yet. And a lot of the 100% solutions do require other people's miracles, like a fully green grid or infinitely cheap energy or something else.
They're also massively expensive and sometimes inefficient.
Right. So yeah, I think you asked earlier, like, what is the right way to scale it? Is like, whatever, the area under the curve should be maximized. So if you can do a pretty good solution that gets you almost all the way off petrochemicals, but you could do it right now, like, totally, that's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So it's sort of decarbonizing as we scale.
I think also when there's mandates in place, like, you must have this by 2030, you must have this by 2035. Smaller companies, smaller startups, even the average consumer, when you think about no more natural gas stoves, we're going to go to all electric, I think they're talking about that now, or you can only have EV cars, you can't get money from a stone, to everyone's point here. So I feel like the mandates kind of sound like it's an either or, you have to sort of situation. However, if you start to think about it in terms of how can we grow the economy by putting, making things more scalable, more cost effective, creating all these new jobs, upskilling the workforce, to me, that sounds like a more digestible conversation.
It's also a growing pie. Like, we have to remember this isn't a static pie. As someone who works in food, I look at population projections all the time. And as we look at population growth to 10 billion by 2050, think about all the things that those additional people will be consuming. They need a lot of food, they need a lot of consumer products, they need a lot of energy. So it's not a static pie and we're figuring out how to carve it up. It's a growing pie. We can't be burning more emissions, but I do think prior alternatives will continue to solve a lot of those problems as we scale up. But as we think about the delta, we've got to spend as much of that in the delta with better technologies.
Yeah, and I would argue, I mean, it's not like we stopped investing in healthcare. It's not like we stopped investing in other industries. It's dynamic, to your point. There's always going to be some sort of delta attached to it, and it's going to be dynamic. And I think we just need to kind of switch our thinking from mandates and either or and good and bad, because you can't just, I know it's kind of pardon the pun, but flip a switch and make it happen. What other alternative resources do you think are the most probable to come on board? Is it wind? Is it solar? Is it hydro?
I think it's all the above, right? Like I think that anything where we're reducing emissions globally, it's like a terrible improv class. It's a yes and. Like every time that you have another solution that can be brought to bear and can be brought to bear quickly, I think all of the above, right? In New York, we're celebrating basically all the ones you just listed, right? There's hydropower. We at one point had some nuclear. There's offshore wind that's coming on board. There's geothermal projects that are happening in and around the city. It's fantastic. Like, and each one of those, thinking that one of those is going to solve the entire problem, even on a state by state or even a regional basis, is, I think, highly inaccurate, right?
Yeah.
Like it will be much more tuned to each geography and geology.
And they also have different characteristics.
Totally.
So they solve different problems. We were talking before the show about pumped hydro. Pumped hydro is great because it's instant on. So it can solve that ramp problem at the end of the day when everybody gets home from work and the sun stops shining. You can flow water immediately and it starts producing power.
Well, I bet if you start making markets in all these alternative forms of energy, you will certainly see stuff come online.
I'm sure there will be
really
more
quick.
of that too.
I mean, look, there's a water market now.
Yep.
Right, which it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but I think once you start getting that institutional interest in it and it becomes like another alternative asset class and another,
Get people betting on it.
yes, start to make markets, and it will have to get you back into the trading profession for sure. Appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me from MarketSite. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.